I think we've always been sustainable. Yeah, I think we've always had a sustainability mindset in that, we've always watched what performance would do, and we were concerned about maximizing outputs and minimizing inputs and all that. And all that is a component of sustainability.
All right, welcome to another episode of the Beef Podcast Show. My name is Dr. Stephanie Hansen. I'm a feedlot nutritionist at Iowa State University, and we've got a really exciting guest with us here today, Dr. John Wagner from Colorado State University. He is a professor with expertise in feedlot nutrition and management. He earned a BS in animal husbandry from Michigan State University, an MS in animal science from Oklahoma State, and a PhD in animal nutrition from Oklahoma State University. John has had a storied career in the feedlot business, including management of a large feedlot in Lamar, Colorado, from both the private and academic sectors. And he's currently preparing for retirement from CSU by wrapping up some publications, and maybe we'll hear later about some of the other fun things he has planned for retirement. So welcome to the show, John.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So I got to know Dr. Wagner probably first through our multi-state committee, would be my guess, the first time that Dan Loy would have taken me along to one of those meetings. And so that would be the CCCC, as I always call it, 308 committee. For those that aren't familiar, the USDA and kind of with the universities, land-grant institutions, we have multi-state committees, and it's an amazing opportunity to get people who are in sort of similar positions, so feedlot researchers in this case, at lots of different institutions, to get an excuse to get together and share an adult beverage and talk about all the fun science that we're all working on, everything from doing similar SOPs in the lab to, what's the biggest challenges that we're facing right now, and some collaborative research. So I've worked with Josh McCann at Illinois. Lots of others on the committee have done collaborative work. So that's been a really great opportunity, especially for me as a brand new faculty member who really didn't grow up in the feedlot industry, to get a chance to meet folks like yourself, John, who, by that time in 2009, when I started, had already had a long, storied career in the feedlot industry.
Well, how old do you think I am? Yeah. I'll make an answer that. We'll put some time frame on that, I'm sure, through the questions that are asked and the answers that I provide.
Absolutely. Well, I tell Dr. Loy that I go to all the age harassment training at Iowa State so that I can get better at it.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So we definitely want to start this by having you kind of give us some highlights of your career. Certainly, we all know that it's not usually a direct path from undergraduate to professor. So tell us a little bit about your history, and then I know we're definitely going to follow up on some kind of really unique pieces of your career that you've had.
Yeah, like many of our students in the animal sciences, animal husbandry arena, I first went to college thinking that you went there to be a doctor, lawyer, veterinarian, teacher, etc. And it didn't take me long when I arrived at Michigan State to realize that doing clinical work on sick dogs just wasn't going to be my deal. I decided early on that I was more interested in animal management and prevention of problems rather than trying to treat all these problems. So early on, I made the decision not to go to veterinary school and pursue a graduate career instead in research and this sort of thing. So that be the start of it. And then in my career itself, I spent approximately the first third of my career in largely an extension role in the state of South Dakota as a extension ruminant nutrition specialist was the official title, but I worked largely with feedlot cattle and backgrounding cattle. And then the middle third of my career, as Stephanie alluded to, I spent managing a research feedlot in Lamar, Colorado for Continental Grain Company. And that feedlot eventually morphed into Five Rivers Cattle Feeding and was owned by JBS for a while and now has different ownership. In 2005, Five Rivers, they gifted the facility to CSU, and I came on board then as a professor. We ended up closing that research facility in 2012. So for the last 10 years, I've been largely in the classroom teaching animal nutrition and feedlot management, and also doing a computer diet balancing course and a graduate course in energetics. So I feel very fortunate that approximately a third of my career was an extension, a third pretty heavy in research, and a third pretty heavy in the teaching arena.
Yeah, you're basically the three legs of the land-grant institution, right?
Yes, very much so. Yeah, very much so.
Absolutely. Okay, lots of good questions here that I have for you. So the first one is, Dr. Wagner and I have a mutual acquaintance, Dan Loy from Iowa State. And I may have reached out to him before this interview and said, I'm going to talk to John. What do you think I should ask him about? And he gave me lots of good topics, but I want to start with this one. He said, I should ask you about sledding on food trays at Michigan State University. So can you tell us about that?
Oh, my. Yeah. If anybody is from Michigan State at any point in time or been there, the ice arena, I think it was called the Munn Ice Arena, has a sloped roof that extends almost right down to the ground. And during blizzard conditions, we, I don't want to use the word stole or steal, but we borrowed cafeteria trays from one of the dormitories and climbed up on that roof and sledded down the roof in the snow. So, yeah, I'm guilty as charged there. I was kind of a wild child in my younger days, a lot calmer now.
I like it. I like it. I actually have a somewhat similar story, but it was in a place that does not get a lot of snow. I did my graduate work at North Carolina State, and I hadn't been there 6 months, and the first snowstorm was like a quarter inch of snow kind of thing, right? And they closed down the university, and the whole town grinds to a halt. And my roommate at the time, who happened to be an undergrad, was from North Carolina, was like, oh my gosh, we got snow. So we literally, like, just on our apartment, which had a fairly steep hill, we had Tupperware lids and we're sliding down that. And, I was like, from Iowa, right? Like, I'm used to way more snow. I was like, you people are crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I bet in Michigan, there was probably a lot of snow where you were sledding.
Particularly that year, it was, I believe it was like 1977, 78, and winter in Michigan at those times, those years, were particularly heavy snowfalls at that time, and particularly cold. My family's from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and I remember going home for winter break and 40 below zero temperatures, and that's not wind chill, that's absolute temperature. And it was pretty brutal those late 70s in Michigan as far as winter goes.
Where are you from in the UP?
Well, my family is now in the Escanaba and Gladstone area of the UP, but basically 100 miles straight north of Detroit. When I graduated from high school, my family moved up there. I actually grew up in the thumb area of Michigan, and if you've talked to anybody from Michigan, they generally do this and point. And it was about 40 miles north of Detroit on a small livestock and grain farm, basically raising cattle, sheep, hogs, corn. So small by today's standards, of course, but I learned a lot during those years on the farm.
Absolutely. We just did a snowshoeing vacation over the recent Christmas holiday. So we're recording this in January of 23. And over the recent Christmas holiday, we went to the UP for a snowshoeing vacation. So kind of we were almost up to Copper Harbor. So we were way up Keweenaw. Yeah. And, they had already had like 90 inches of snow for the season or something. Right. So yeah. So let's transition with this idea of snow in mind. One of the things that you have helped or tried to help feedlot producers in particular understand is how we might better deal with these winter storms. You kind of alluded it to in your answer there too. Weather is only getting more variable, more extreme. As we record this today, it was -5 this morning in Iowa. And so tell us a little bit about your thoughts about what producers need to be keeping in mind as they think about winter storm management.
Well, there's two things that come to mind. One is keep them eating, keep them consuming feed of some kind, and two, make them as comfortable as you can. Now, both those tasks are difficult in a storm situation, but back in, it would have been 1997 or so, my first start of winter in southeast Colorado, we had 30-some inch snowfall event, 50-mile-an-hour winds and, 15-foot drifts, and call out the National Guard, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that we did manage to do is we kept feeding cattle. Now, by the end, we had run out of most of our commodities, including corn, but we always had our corn silage pile, and we were feeding straight corn silage at the end. But basically, try and keep them eating something. A lot of feedlots, if they're on a 4-ration system, they might drop down to the number 3 ration with a little more roughage in it. They might increase the rumensin concentration to the a higher, allowable level to help as far as maintaining uniform consumptions. But anything you can do to keep them eating is the first and foremost thing. That might include one of the keys is to get into the pen and scoop off just the feeding alley. Time doesn't allow you perhaps to clean the entire pen, but if you can get the gates opened and push snow off the feed alley, that gives the cattle someplace to go close to the feed bunk and have a better chance of continuing their consumption that way.
Yeah, I think that's a good point that we don't always think about. It's sometimes surprising to people how much intakes fall off in the winter, especially in these really, really cold times. But when I explain it to producers, I think if you were warm and cozy in the place that you had bedded down, especially since cattle tend to do things like they lay down before it rains or before it snows because they keep that spot underneath them dry, right? They're kind of protective of that. They tend to not want to get up and wander around. So they're like, no, I'm good. So how do you stimulate that? And really by cleaning off that apron area in front of the bunk, you're encouraging them to say, oh, this is a place where I'm not going to have to use energy and slog through 30 inches of snow to get up to the bunk. And then once one animal's up there, that kind of herd instinct and behavior, like, oh, Bob's at the bunk, I better go up there too, right?
Yeah. I think you make that the most comfortable place for them to be is up by the bunk, and to go along with that, I really think our feedlots in a winter storm situation underutilized bedding. I know they're reluctant to put bedding out there because they have to eventually haul it out, but if you can use corn stalks or something like that as bedding adjacent to the feed apron, I think that'll also help bring those cattle up and make them more comfortable. There's some really good data out of South Dakota State showing the performance advantage associated with using bedding. And I realize where I'm located here in Colorado, we're a lot further south than South Dakota, but I still think we could make better use of bedding in our feedlots. One of the comments was, well, we'd have to maintain a supply or inventory of bedding. Well, one of the experiments I did, I'll call it experiment loosely, when I was in Lamar, is I brought in a truckload of wheat straw in large square bales, stacked it on the facility, and then let it set to see how long it would last. And, like 5 years later, I still had a stack of wheat straw there. And so I really think that having a supply of bedding on hand and hope you don't use it, and when you do use it, then you replace it for the next season.
Yeah, a couple of things. One, especially if producers are strategic about it, that can serve as a windbreak if you put it in the right place. It can be a real bad windbreak too if you don't think about where you put it, right? You don't want to create drifts where you're like, crap, I never had those before. But yeah, so think about that. If you're ever looking for information on windbreaks, I mean, obviously all the extension folks have it, but Wyoming DOT created the original windbreak, right? In terms of thinking about controlling snow over the highway system and stuff. So I remember the first time I put up my snow fence at my house, I was like, what does the Wyoming DOT say for how far it needs to be from the place I'm trying to protect?
Yeah, there was a very interesting presentation at an old range cow symposium many, many years ago. And there was a professor there from Montana or Wyoming or someplace like that had a set of slides. And I mean, it was the god awfulest day you could imagine, snowing sideways and all that. And then he packed up his graduate students and went out to do some research. And they were building these model windbreaks out there in a blizzard, trying to measure, what angle to the wind they should be and how tall they should be and how open they should be, 20% open, 80% closed, that kind of stuff. And it was really interested, and it made me realize that I didn't have it so bad in graduate school at all compared to them. So
it's all about perspective, isn't it?
Yeah. One thing about using corn stalks as your bedding source and your windbreak, of course, when you're gonna harvest those, September, or October, you're past the time when you'd have to worry about heat stress, so to speak, by blocking the prevailing wind. So yeah, that's a good point you made there. You don't want a bad windbreak either, as far as preventing cooling in the summer.
So I was going to circle back. So was that some of Zach Smith's data, some of his more recent stuff that you were referring to from the bedding? Yeah. So Dathan's.
There's some older stuff that Carl Berkelo would have done, 20 years ago or so too.
Yeah. So Dathan Smirchak is my current PhD student, and he was the master student that helped work with Zach. But basically what Dr. Wagner is referring to for our listeners is studies were basically in South Dakota, where it was plenty cold in the winter and they had extreme cold in a part of that study. I actually linked to this study off of my LinkedIn account. We were joking about social media earlier, but LinkedIn is a pretty nice way to get to share research and other things like that. So this is off of my LinkedIn account earlier in January during one of our cold spells, because their data are very nice to show that, having bedding in those pens really increased the performance of those cattle, or perhaps prevented some of the reduction of performance of those cattle during those cold spells, because it makes them not lose as much energy to just the process of staying warm. Okay, so you mentioned Lamar in there a couple of times, and you talked about that in your introduction too. So one of the things that Dr. Loy also said I should ask you is, what is it like to be gifted to a university?
Yeah, I feel a little bit like the player to be named later and the baseball trades and all that kind of stuff. That was an interesting experience coming back to the university. I didn't need to go through the application and interview process and all that kind of stuff, but also from that perspective, even though I was new on campus and trying to find my way around, it was assumed by administration higher up the chain that, I had been at CSU since 2005, that I knew the ropes as far as all the bureaucracy and all that and here. And I can say it now. I told my department head this. It didn't matter what I said. Now it'd take them 2 years to fire me, and by then it wouldn't matter. Some of these universities have vice presidents in charge of the vice presidents, and it's a maze to walk through. That was the biggest shock. The other thing that was amazing to me is when I was on campus at South Dakota State, it was pre-cell phone. And so students would get out of class, walk to their next class in groups of 4 or 5 or whatever, visiting and having a big old time. And I get back to Colorado State in 2012, and students, they get out of class, and everybody's walking by themselves with their nose in the phone. And I thought to myself, my, how things changed, and just think of all the opportunity that of interacting with fellow classmates that they're missing by being in their phone like that. Related to that, at the time, the wildlife people here at CSU were studying the migration and the pattern of travel by squirrels. And so a certain percentage of the squirrels on campus had radio collars on them with these little antenna. And I said, even the squirrels have their nose in their phone, so I felt a little bit like a fish out of water there.
So tell us a little bit about I guess maybe from both when it was a private, feedlot, and then also when it was a part of CSU. You did some great work down there. What are some of the findings or applications of your work that you're most proud of from your time there?
Yeah, one of the things we did is we were very involved in the initial studies with Optiflex, ractopamine from the Elanco Animal Health. So that was a pretty interesting time for me. Going through a study like that and then being inspected by FDA and so on and so forth, and that was real interesting. And then another thing we worked on a lot there was different non-protein nitrogen levels in feedlot diets, and one of the things that as an industry we're accused of is overfeeding nitrogen, but we don't do that just for the sake of feeding nitrogen. We do have really good data showing that rumen degradable nitrogen in steam flake diets in particular is very helpful. It helps promote more performance. Another interesting thing we were looking at in those days, we were looking at fat concentration in the diet, and rule of thumb talking about 7% fat or 7.5% fat in a feedlot diet. Well, one study I fed 8 and didn't see the top. I don't know how high we can really go in a finishing diet with steam flake corn as the energy source. So some of those things would be controversial if you talk about feeding 8% fat in a diet, but we were able to get away with some of that.
Probably today you couldn't afford to do that anyway.
Well, that's true.
Yeah. I mean, to your protein comment, Alan Trinkle was my predecessor here at Iowa State, and he did some nice work showing that like when we implant cattle, they see a performance response up to that 14.5% crude protein, which would be higher than what NRC would say we necessarily need for that level of performance. But like you said, we're not doing it intentionally. It's because we tend to be right now doing things like using co-products as an energy source, and we're dragging that protein along with it. But your point is a good one, which is at some point, things like phosphorus and nitrogen, we need to do as good a job as we can of bringing all those into kind of tight alignment with what the animal actually requires.
Yeah, you said something about phosphorus and nitrogen and stuff. One of my big experiences in Lamar was working with high sulfate water. We would suffer through 2,500 ppm sulfate during the summer, and if we could get water supply at 1,500, we thought that was a luxury. And so managing the sulfur issue was a big thing that I worked at while in Lamar, and one of the things we learned is that cattle will indeed acclimate to higher sulfur levels. But the other problem that you'd have is stacking. I'll call it stacking of risk factors, in that if you're dealing with poor sulfate or a lot of sulfates in your water, you need to watch how much of the byproducts, the co-products that you feed is just, it's a fact of life that if you have high sulfate water, you probably can't feed as much of the distiller's grains and that kind of thing in your diet. So, managing those special problems is one thing that we did in Lamar as well.
Absolutely. And, your sulfate work was part of the stuff that we cited later in some of our sulfur reviews from Iowa State. Just, that was one of the big things I worked on when I first came here, because they were like, well, we're killing cattle from high sulfur. Go fix it. And I was like, okay. So, and to your point there, right? Producers often don't necessarily remember that the water is such an important piece of that math, right? So your total sulfur that animal is consuming is as much from the water sometimes or more than it is actually from the feed. And you're right, you push them over the limit if you're like, well, we're tolerable on the water, but we brought in something, molasses or corn gluten feed or distillers or something else that was higher in sulfur, and it pushes them over the limit. Or transitioning cattle at the same time when we had some of those high sulfur, right? When the pH was really kind of roller coastering.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then early on, we were taking wet distillers, for example, directly from the plant and not mixing that and diluting out the bad loads with the less sulfur loads, that you get a more uniform product. One of the trials that we did at Lamar is we had a high sulfur distiller solubles and a low sulfur distiller solubles, and used a random number generator to decide which one we'd feed in a given day. And the variability on a day-to-day basis increased death loss, from 1.5% or so on yearlings to like 5 or 6%. It was an interesting study to do as well. The bottom line is be careful of your distiller source and make sure they are indeed doing something to try and make the product they're sending out, the co-product they're sending out, more uniform in sulfur as opposed to highly variable.
Yeah, I think communication was a big challenge with a lot of those merchandisers when they were first getting those first several years. I think that's gotten tremendously better, and they're much more aware of the risks. I am curious, do you think, like your random number generator study, so I assume that was with steam flake corn?
Yes, yeah.
Do you think if you were to go back and do that study again, but to maybe manage it with a higher roughage inclusion, you would have a pretty significant decrease in that death loss?
Yeah, I think so. I think you would, because that of course is related to pH and the dissociation of hydrogen sulfide and all that rumen stoichiometry. That's a big word, isn't it? I used to when I was in organic chemistry, I used to know what that word meant, but that's a good point. pH would have a big impact on that. So if you use more roughage, you can get away with feeding a more variable product or a higher sulfur product because of the increase in rumen pH as opposed to a high steam flake corn diet.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually going to ask you, so if you came from Michigan and then South Dakota, but you were at Oklahoma there too. So at Oklahoma State, was that your exposure to steam flake corn?
Yes, that and also sorghum grain. One of the first questions I asked when I went down there to interview for graduate school is I asked to see some sorghum grain. We just didn't have it in Michigan at all in those years. So yeah, that was a big. Yeah, cottonseed cake was another one, and tarantulas, that was another one.
What?
Yeah, I did some supplementation studies of cattle out on range, and we had these rubber feed pans, and after they're done eating their supplement, we would always turn those feed pans upside down, and quite frequently you'd go the next morning to turn one over and there'd be a tarantula staring up at you that was underneath that feed pan. So that kind of shocked this Michigan boy too. So
what is the feeding value of a tarantula?
I don't know. I don't know, but those hairy legs, I wonder what kind of roughage value they have.
So scratch factor.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness. Okay. So I wanted to give you a chance to tell the listeners a little bit about the sustainability initiative that CSU has been having happen over the last few years. I know you got some recent hires there in the feedlot sector with Pedro Carvalho, but also others. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about what that's looking like?
Yeah, we also hired Dr. Sarah Place here in a sustainability role. I'll say it, it's controversial. I think we've always been sustainable. Yeah, I think we've always had a sustainability mindset in that, we've always watched what performance would do, and we were concerned about maximizing outputs and minimizing inputs and all that. And all that is a component of sustainability. And so I'm a little bothered by that terminology right now. So it used to be known here at CSU as the Sustainable Livestock Systems, blah, 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 something else, right? And now it's been rebranded as Ag Next. And, what they're trying to do is get a message out to the public that we are concerned about the environment and how we care for our planet and all that kind of stuff, and and also get the word out to producers that there are some things that you can do to help mitigate our impact on the environment. And so they're putting together a team of scientists and people to indeed investigate that. And our couple of latest ones we've hired was Pedro Carvalho, came from the Desert Research Station in California, in El Centro, I think that's where it was. And then also Sarah Place, who came to us from Elanco Animal Health, and they're going to be working in this arena. Their appointments are largely outreach, meaning they'll be very visible to the public and producers and out in the state. At CSU, we call a lot of those positions outreach positions as opposed to the traditional extension term. But basically, that's what they're indeed on board for. There's going to be some additional hires in that arena. Not sure exactly what positions, but it's going to be quite interesting. I'm excited for what they're going to bring to the table, and they're getting going in a big way.
Yeah, I think I've seen the list that has some like a forage nutritionist and some other things, which is good to see that kind of whole picture.
Yeah, and a big data person that handles data management and data manipulation, and that can handle some of the really sophisticated data sets that they're generating, and they have a dairy person hired, and economists, and a very integrated approach around the sustainability question.
Okay, great. So thanks for telling us a little bit about that. The data thing makes me think of something else that I knew I wanted to talk to you about, and that was your penchant for meta-analysis. So do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about what a meta-analysis is, and maybe tell us a little bit about some of the meta-analysis that you've been involved in, or maybe why you like that approach?
Yeah, what I like about that approach is that if you are visited by pharmaceutical company A, that person would come in with a stack of data supporting their product, and that would be largely handpicked. They would bring in the positive studies and share with you those, and you wouldn't see everything else. And so what this meta-analysis does is it allows you to go through and find as many studies that apply to a particular problem, and look at the effects of those studies on the overall picture, whether or not, basically, I suppose it's equivalent to the majority of the studies having this effect, and trying to outline what the effect would be across a wide variety of locations and studies and all this, as opposed to looking at, a hand-picked handful of positive studies. So I've been involved in looking at that with various feed additives, and then also looking at it with implant programs and those kind of things. One of the problems with it is that we've had a tendency over the years to publish only the positive studies, and negative data, negative results aren't published. So you have to use some techniques to try and sort through that, whether or not there's a good representation of positive and negative studies present. And basically, you're looking at the shape of the bell-shaped curve, basically, to try and make that determination. And so, yeah, I like that approach. It's been used in the medical arena a long time, and we're seeing more of it now in animal sciences.
Yeah, it's got a good, so as a part of that statistical analysis, you can account for well-powered studies that had lots of replication and give them more weight than studies that had very limited replication. And that can be, so that weighting factor is one of the things that can be a really nice thing, because, one of the challenges, I guess, maybe with research, as we're both feedlot nutritionists, is thinking about small pen, individual animals, the experimental unit, or small bunks as the experimental unit at the university for that kind of mechanism of action, discovery-based research, and then looking at that at the applied scale level where you've got 100 head or 200 head in a feedlot where you're not going to have individual intake. You could have a lot of cattle to get good intake numbers, but you can be stronger on something like carcass data or health data and things like that. So that's where I think the meta-analysis can really help kind of start to tie together some messaging for producers to understand what those results mean.
Yeah, and the other thing that you have to be careful of too is, and I asked some of the meta-analysis gurus this, people would respond, well, that doesn't describe my circumstance or whatever. But in meta-analysis, variation is good because you want to look at the response across a wide variety of conditions and factors and trying to tease out, whether or not there is something there strictly due to the article in question. So in meta-analysis, variation is good. In our standard hypothesis-driven research, you try and minimize variation.
Yep.
So it's two different mindsets there, and that's a hurdle that some people have to overcome. We have colleagues that will just badmouth meta-analysis up one side and down the other. And I think if you try and think of it in terms of what a traditional study would do, that's where you get into some trouble.
Do you think it's going to be even harder in the future to have enough papers or enough data sets to be able to do meta-analysis, because we are kind of moving to this point now where we don't replicate a lot of research, right? It's like, oh, somebody's already done that. It's time to move on because research is so expensive. There's not a lot of incentive to say, well, we should do that again. We'll do it 10 times and see how many times it does what we expect it to do.
Yeah, I think so. I think we've moved away from the lack of publication with respect to negative data. We're publishing more and more of those studies that don't show an effect, and I think that's good. But I do think the players in this arena are becoming fewer and further between. That it used to be that several universities would do lots of great feedlot studies, and that number is just dwindling all the time. You think of Iowa State and Oklahoma State and some of those places still do great work along those lines, but others, the support has virtually gone to nil, and is very hard to get certain studies funded, and a lot of it has morphed into strictly product testing because you have to pay the bills somehow. So yeah, I think it's going to be hard to get enough decent studies in order to do some of those analyses.
So I want to ask you your thoughts kind of on what you've seen as a snapshot over your career. So I want to start with so sometimes I like to call our cattle today the modern cow, right? Or the modern steer who can gain 4 pounds a day and finish at 1,500 pounds. What are your thoughts on how that beast in the feedlot has changed over the decades since you've been involved in research? And how do you feel we're doing in terms of understanding his requirements?
Yeah, the big difference now as compared to when I started is it used to be every steer was sold at about 1,100 pounds regardless of degree of fatness. And, we used to talk about 4/10 of an inch cover being an ideal endpoint. And basically now that describes a yearling feeder steer, basically. And so that's been a big change to go to these heavier weights, going to 1,500 pounds now instead of 1,100. It used to be they're all sold live rather than formula basis. And so one of the things that's happened is, a couple things that have happened is, feedlot managers need to be experts in carcass quality and carcass endpoint and carcass value and those kind of things. And then the other thing on a negative perspective is that we've inherited a bunch of problems, so to speak, that are associated with feeding to heavier weights, whether that's feet and leg issues, liver abscess issues, feedlot heart disease issues, those kind of things. I'm convinced that this increase in feedlot heart disease we see is just like coronary disease in adult or humans, obesity related and excess weight and these sorts of things. So that's the big difference is the weights that we're feeding to now.
Yeah, and we've been doing some research recently on to your point about how much fatter these cattle are when we harvest, right? So since they are so much heavier, most of our NRC guidelines, actually, if you look at the table in the NRC, we have cattle that don't even fit on that table anymore, right? It kind of maxes out around 1,250, 1,300 pounds. They've got cattle that I'm starting them on beta agonist trials, heavier than any cattle that are on that table in the NRC. So average choice would have been 28% fat, and our cattle have been 31 to 32% fat going out the door. But that's what they take to have 1/2 inch to 6/10 of an inch of back fat and to be mostly choice to high choice and low prime. So it is a different beast that we're feeding today. And it's so interesting because fat is metabolically active, and we have not thought about that the way that like the human researchers are really starting to dig, you right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I was on review panels for some of the USDA projects, and the amount of human literature in the obesity world that is cited in some of these, that's starting to be cited in some of these feedlot-oriented studies is amazing because I think, Stephanie, we're starting to make that realization that fat is indeed a metabolically active tissue, and where has that been studied mostly is in the human arena. So that's a good observation.
Yeah, and I mean, as a mineral nutritionist, I've always appreciated this, but the cool thing is that at the cellular level, we're all pretty much the same creature. And so in terms of, there's always some subtle differences between species, but the things that they have learned on the human arena are often very applicable to what we can do on the cattle side and vice versa.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the reasons why that I've made the decision to retire is that when I was trained and when I was starting my career, we didn't go there at all. We didn't worry about integrating what we learn in humans with what we do with our livestock species, and I just feel that myself, I'm not prepared to. I'm not comfortable with that. I don't know enough. I wasn't trained that way, and so that's one of the reasons why I'm trying to back away some and retire. I'm not going to disappear, but there's a lot smarter and younger people than me out there to continue this.
Well, you've set them up on a good track. So tell us a little bit about what your plans are for retirement. I heard that you're a gardener. What kind of garden do you have?
Vegetables. I really like growing pumpkins, and so I raise pumpkins for the grandkids, that kind of a deal. And the other thing that's kind of interesting is we have a largest zucchini contest at our church. Is that the gardener that can grow the largest zucchini, gets a prize. We all put $1 in the hat, that kind of a deal. And so I like growing squash and pumpkins, and then also I do some of the traditional, green beans and peas and that vegetable stuff. I do a lot of that. And then another thing I like to do is a lot of woodworking. I call my style a Jack Pine Savage look. I don't use a lot of sandpaper. I don't use a lot of intricate work as far as a router is concerned and cutting smooth edges and all that. It's more yellow pine, and I like it. It's the style, and then we do some camping and that kind of thing. And so anyway, that's what the plans are. I do have a consulting client that I work with, and maybe I'll do a little bit more of that. But I'm excited for it. It's time.
Well, you've always been a pretty prolific writer and author. Did I hear that you were also maybe thinking about a fiction career potentially?
Well, I don't, some people would say some of my research is a fiction career, right?
Oh, you teed that one right up.
Yeah. But anyway, those that would disagree with me, I suppose. But yeah, I heard a story about a delivery of cats from the eastern part of the United States along the Santa Fe Trail to San Francisco. And I was sitting there thinking, and I said, that's a book that has to be written, has to be researched and written. So I don't know if that's the topic, but one of my ambitions is to write some kind of book of fiction too.
Nice. And obviously the title writes itself, right? Herding cats.
Yeah, herding cats. Yeah, yeah. So
Oh, very nice. Well, I've got into fiction, published my first book during the pandemic. So if you ever need any tips, I'll be happy to touch base.
yeah.
Clearly anyone can do it if I can do it. So, okay. Well, I think we're ready for our final 3 questions here.
Okay.
So we can have a little chat about this. So question number 1, what is your favorite beef resource?
My favorite beef resource is it's kind of hard to pick a single one, but I do like the University Station research reports, and I see a big a huge thing that happened many years ago. Danny Sims and company out of K-State put a lot of those resources on a database that you could search them electronically. And I saw that as a real turning point as far as, working in this arena. So, Iowa State does them and Nebraska does them and K-State does them. So I like the university research reports. From a publication perspective, a peer-reviewed publication perspective, I like to use Applied Animal Science, the publication by the professional animal scientist. It used to be known as the Professional Animal Scientist, the American Registry of Professional Animal Sciences, ARPAS. I like to use that. But my favorite would be the various university research reports.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. This has been a really fun question to hear because I think other than hearing the beef NRC from a few of our nutrition guests, we've heard a lot of different answers for this one. And I'm not sure anybody had yet said the station reports or the university reports. And I think that is an amazing kind of, so oftentimes the data are published there before they're out in a peer-reviewed publication. And oftentimes they're written for language that's more consumable by a producer. So that's a great place for folks to look for data.
You mentioned the NRC. One of the things that I've seen the NRC kind of morph into is I see it as a beef cattle biology textbook, in that it has lots and lots of basic information about carbohydrates in beef cattle and about fat in beef cattle and protein and minerals and so on and so forth. And it used to be basically a compilation of tables, of requirement tables, and now it's evolved into much more than that. So I see it as a good resource for some basic knowledge along those lines. But as far as staying current with new research and all that, it's static. It's one point in time. They renew it every 15 years or whatever it is. So
absolutely, totally agree. Okay, second question. What's a non-beef related resource or a non-beef related book that you're reading right now?
I read a lot of World War II history, and I'm currently reading a book called Stalingrad. It's about the Battle of Stalingrad in World War II. Many believe it's the turning point of World War II, where the Nazis suffered a tremendous setback. And so, yeah, I do read a lot of that stuff, and that's what I'm into right now.
Are you a big reader?
Yes, I try and read every night, something non career related, something different. Whatever it's usually history that I read.
Nice. Yeah, I'm the same way. It's fiction for me, but I need something that's not work related so that I can sleep.
Yeah, exactly.
Turn the brain off.
Yeah.
Okay, so the final question is there a trait in someone that you admire that has helped make them successful?
My my trait that I look for is persistence. No matter how many times you get knocked down, you get back up and keep trying. No matter how many times you get knocked down, you get back up and keep trying. And I could repeat that and repeat that and repeat that. And so that's to me is the number one trait. It's not those that are successful in every endeavor that they do. If you succeed in everything, you're not learning anything. I mean, the best way to learn is to fail. And my gosh, the number of stupid ideas that I've had greatly outpaces the number of good ones. And so, yeah, persistence is what I would say is the trait.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one. Something that we sometimes have challenges with in certain individuals, but persistency, resiliency, tenacity, grit, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, John, this has been really fun having a conversation with you here today. Hopefully your first podcast wasn't too painful.
No, it wasn't. It's the host, you yourself and the organization, they've made it painless and helped me through it a lot. I just haven't done this. I did the online teaching thing during the pandemic and didn't get along very well with it at all. But having this two-way dialogue was very, very useful, I think.
Excellent.